From that particular deal, I recall the first offer you had gotten was actually an option to purchase. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I couldn't quite understand what was going on because I had received this letter offering me a pretty large sum of money, but it was an option to purchase and they wanted like 7 years time.
Mm.
And I just had the good fortune and timing of taking the course that Craig was teaching for LandGate and brought the letter to class with me and showed Craig, and we pulled it up as an example in front of the whole class, which was, you know, I don't always share things if I don't feel confident about it. And I'm like, oh, sure, let's pull it up and use it as an example. And at the time, we didn't have the knowledge of the Power Pathway project. So we were all scratching our heads trying to figure out it's 4 miles to the west to get to a transmission line, and even further, another, mile and a half, mile and a quarter to get over to those substations. Or if you go south, it's, oh gosh, 7 or 8 miles to another substation. And so we were trying to figure out what was going on, but then we eventually worked together, and Brooke and I actually looked up Excel and figured out that's what was going on. And we were super excited that day. And shortly after that, we listed it on LandGate. We started getting more inquiries. So I was getting more letters in the mail, more phone calls, and I would have to call Craig and Brooke and say, okay, I have no experience in this. Please help guide me through this because I am being inundated with people who are interested in asking questions. So we've all worked together and dug in and kind of figured out what was going on up there.
Absolutely. How many, after listing on LandGate, how many offers did you get total after that on this particular one?
I had 7 offers before I went under before I went under the option to lease, but I ended up with probably 12 different developers reaching out because I've still had them reaching out in the last few months, just checking to make sure that my option was still in place. Nothing had terminated. Just people who are kind of late to the game who are just looking for an opportunity. Which is interesting. I can't blame them because something could fall apart and they might find their little last minute in, or someone may have been holding out and didn't want to participate. And then finally at the last minute decided if you can't beat them, join them. So it's been fascinating. Here's a little side story. I had 1,000 acres listed for sale. That's about 15 minutes to the southeast of my property, nowhere near transmission lines, but apparently abutting a property that's large enough it had transmission lines on it, even though those lines were a couple miles away. The day we were closing on the sale of that property, my sellers came to closing and let me know that a company called Galehead, who actually has been searching these properties through you guys, they were one of the ones that had reached out to me kind of last minute, had reached out to my sellers of this property we're about to close on, saying, we'd like to put an option on this. And they called her the day of closing.
Wow.
The fascinating part, however, was that the ranch we were closing on had conservation easements on it. So it was not able to go under lease, which allowed the buyer to go forward and close. But it was pretty interesting moment because if it weren't under conservation easement, those sellers would have had an opportunity to consider terminating that, walking away, potentially paying a penalty, but it would have been very complex. It wouldn't have been a real smooth move for them to try and back out. But it was kind of an interesting phone call to get the morning that we're headed to closing.
Absolutely, especially the day of closing. How the stars align that way is fascinating.
We had
Now,
it under contract for 4.5 months, and the call is the day of closing.